So back in the summer of 2008, late summer of 2008, my wife and I had, at the time, three kids. We had a 4-year-old daughter, a 3-year-old son, a 1-year-old daughter, and then my wife was great with child, so we had a fourth kid on the way. We were really in the middle of a hectic season of life. And it was hot, we were busy. We actually lived in Oklahoma at the time, and Oklahoma in the late summer is just oppressively hot, right? As soon as the monsoon sets up in New Mexico, basically what New Mexico does is steal all of Oklahoma's moisture. It becomes like 70 degrees here. It's wonderful, and Oklahoma turns into like 105, 110. It's miserable, and we were hot, we were miserable, we were broke, and we didn't have a lot of entertainment options. And so we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our day, and decided to do something we had never done before. We lived right along the South Canadian River, within a couple miles of the river, and so we decided to take our family for a walk in the river, which sounds crazy until you realize in Oklahoma, so hot that the river is basically gone, right? The water is 6 inches deep for the most part throughout the thing. And so we took our family out there. Our oldest two kids were walking on their own. Our middle daughter at the time, who was our youngest daughter, was walking when you were holding her hand. And then our fourth one was hitching a ride with my wife. So like it was pretty easy. We're walking along and we enjoyed the river. We'd never done this before, and it was a lot of fun. We're out there for a while, and as you start to do this, you start to relax a little bit. You realize how great this is and how much fun it is. It was evening. The sun was starting to go down. There was plenty of light out, but it was that golden hour when everything is beautiful. And as we walked along the river, it was one of the better days that we had had. Our oldest two ran off in front of us, and they were 50, 100 yards in front of us. We could still see them. They were up around, kind of around the bend, but you could still see where they were. And my wife and I were walking and talking and laughing. It was wonderful. Until out of the corner of my eye, I saw something happen. I had been looking at my wife, but I happened to glance up in time to see my daughter standing there walking along the river, and my son just disappeared. He was gone. He was above the water, and then he was gone. So I took off running, and I'm sprinting in this river, and like I said, the water is this deep, so it wasn't a hard sprint, but I'm sprinting, and they were about 50 yards in front of us at the time. And the way that my brain remembers this now is eerie. Now, whether it was that way when it happened or not, I don't know. But what I remember is I ran up, and he was actually had walked up onto a place where there was a log that had fallen into the river, and it had formed an eddy in the water, where the water had spun, and all of the sand had burrowed away, and what had been 6 inches of water was now like 5 feet of water. And I ran up to see my 3-year-old son, as I remember in my mind him sliding under the log with his hands just reaching up and going down into the darkness. If I hadn't seen in that moment, he would have had no way to get out. But I saw him in that moment, and I ran up and I looked at him and I said, "Get out of that water, kid! What are you doing? You should know better than this." That's not what I did, right? No, I reached down and I grabbed him up out of the water and I just started hugging him. Right? I started hugging him. I'm holding him tight, and it scared me. Some of you know that feeling. Some of you have feelings even worse where you wish you could have been there and you didn't. But I looked at this, and I looked at this kid, and I hugged him, and I set out that I was going to do everything I could to make sure that type of thing didn't happen again. Why didn't I yell at him and tell him to get out of the water? Because he couldn't save himself. Right? He wasn't going to be able to just get himself out of the water. The last 3 weeks, as we've been going through Genesis, we started in Genesis 1, and Genesis 1 was amazing, right? 4 weeks ago, we did Genesis 1, and it was awesome to get to talk about God creating man in his own image and how God made us and made us special and powerful in his image, different than the rest of creation. It was wonderful. But then the next 3 weeks, if you've been here for the last 3 weeks, have been kind of hard, right? Because what we've dealt with in Genesis 3 through 11 is the brokenness of man away from God, right? We've been dealing with this idea that on our own, man, we can say and do things that are just unbelievable. I bring all this up Because on our own, we can't save ourselves. Right? On our own, we can't fix this problem. I can't just set out to say, I'm going to be better, and I'm never going to be mean to anybody again, and I'm not going to be judgmental, and I'm not going to look at anything, I'm not going to choose anything, I'm just going to fix it. Because on our own, there's something in us. If you did what we talked about last week and went and read Romans 7, talking about, I know the good that I want to do, but the stuff I don't want to do, that's the stuff I keep on doing, and that's how I know that there's this like sin living inside me. If you did that, then you know we can't save ourselves. I love telling the story of Simon the Stylite. There's a guy in the 500s who decided to live on top of they called it a stylus, but it was just a pillar. He climbed up on an old Greek pillar, and he lived on top of this, some say 60-meter tall pillar. Probably wasn't that tall, but he lived on top of this pillar. And people brought him food and water. And he spent like 30 years on top of this pillar. And people asked, he was trying to do this so he would no longer sin. But as people came to talk to him and asked him, so what's it like to never sin anymore? And he'd say, I don't know. Even up on top of this thing, he knew where his mind was going. We can't save ourselves. That's why what we're going to study this morning is so great. So what I want to ask you to do this morning is turn to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to look this morning at the beginning of where the story changes. We're going to see where God says, I'm not going to just leave you here. I'm not going to just leave you in this place. You see, as we've been talking about, man continually pushes to be like God without God. But God, who is a loving Father, is not going to leave humanity in this place with no hope. And so this morning, in this place where it feels like there's no hope, God's going to introduce some hope. And so we're going to meet a new person today. We're going to meet Abraham, only at the time we're looking at him, his name is Abram. We're going to meet this guy, and we're going to see how it is that God starts the process that ultimately brings you and I a hope of salvation. So starting in Genesis chapter 12, I'm going to read verse 1 through 3. And we're going to go from here, seeing God's plan played out in just 3 short verses. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. Now, if it sounded like I was stuttering and stumbling, it's because when I went to Bible college, the very first passage I ever had to memorize was this passage. It was in a little different format than this one, but this passage we were actually called to memorize, which doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, right? The Lord said to Abram, leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to the land I will show you. Okay, that's great. But what we see here is what's called the Abrahamic covenant. What we see here is God, who has made humanity and says, as we talked about last week, everything that seems to be going on in their hearts is pointed towards evil all the time. Is God looking and saying, I'm going to, from those people, call somebody out, that in that people, in this guy, I'm going to start a blessing that is ultimately going to bring about my Messiah. It's going to bring my son. He's going to come through this line. Through these people, something is going to change. And we're going to start that today. So I want to break that passage down with you guys today and then look at the implications of that and what that means for you and for I. And it starts this way in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. So Abram was actually started in Ur, and his family moved up to Haran, which is what is modern-day Turkey, or actually might actually be a little bit east of there. But where we see this here is this guy is with his family and he's just living life, and then God starts talking to him, which sounds a little crazy, right? God starts talking to this guy and starts interacting with this guy, and he says something to him. He says, I want you to do something. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your people, the people who are like you, and I want you to leave your family, your father's house, and go. Go to the land I will show you. So a little bit of history on Abram. Abram at this time is 75 years old. All right? He's not 25. He's not 15. He's 75. I don't actually know that there are any 75-year-olds in here. There may be one or two. But the idea of loading up and leaving your home and your family at 75 does not sound awesome. I am 47, and just up and leaving does not sound awesome. In fact, when God called us here back to New Mexico, I was in 2016. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave where I was. I was serving in a church. I was serving God boldly, excited about what God was doing where I was. I had a healthy family, and life was good. And New Mexico for me was a memory of when I was an idiot as a kid. And we laugh about it, but I'll be honest with you. I was deathly afraid that there would be people who would show up to church one Sunday, see me on stage, and say, I ain't ever going back to that place. I remember that guy. I've actually had people that remembered me from when I was a kid show up at this place, and they threw stuff at me. No, they didn't leave, but it was that feeling of, I don't want to go back. The idea for Abram to be 75. Abram did not have, he was married, he and his wife were married, but they did not have any kids. But God says something to him, kind of wild. He says, I just want you to go. I want you to go somewhere. I want you to start walking. I'm going to show you where you're going, but I'm not going to give you a PowerPoint presentation of what it's going to look like. I'm not going to tell you what it's going to look like. I'm just going to take you, and you're going to trust that I'm going to bless you. This is important because what we see with Abram is a blueprint for how it is that God interacts with his people. It's very rare that God actually explains where he's taking you. He just says to go. Faith is believing in the evidence of what I can't see. And what Abram does here, or what God is calling Abram to do here, is to just trust him. To just go and to trust that the blessings are on the other way. Now we're going to see past this what those blessings are, and we see this in verse 2. He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. So God says to go, and Abram, when he goes, God says, I'm going to make you into a great nation, I'm going to bless you, I will make you into a famous person, and you will become a blessing to other people. So God says some things here that are really important. He says, I will make you into a great nation. Now, a great nation. You're 75 years old and you don't have any kids. How do you become a great nation? It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? There are certain things physically that don't work at 75 that work a lot better when you're 25. Having kids does not happen at 75. But God says to Abram, if you go, I'm going to do something in you that's miraculous. If you will just go, I'm going to make you into a nation. I'm going to do something in you that you couldn't do on your own. I'm going to do something through you that you could never produce on your own. If you will go, if you will not stay where you are in your safe little space with your country and your people where everything is good, if you will go, I'm going to make you into a great nation. You're going to go from being two people into being a nation. Now, we know this people today as the Jewish people. We have some people in this very room who are descendants of this very conversation. So God blessed this conversation, but we didn't know this at the time. If you're Abram, this sounds wild. He says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you, blessing. I'm going to take care of what it is that you need. He says, I'm going to make your name famous. Now, this is really interesting. If you were here last week we talked about the Tower of Babel and how these people wanted to make a name for themselves and how God struck that down, which makes it seem like being famous seems like a bad thing. But God says here, I'm going to make Abram, I'm going to make you into a famous person. What's the difference? Why is it there is something inside us that desires to be known? What's the difference between Abram and the people of Babel? The people of Babel wanted to make their own name famous so that people could look at them and see how awesome they were. What God is doing through Abram is saying, I'm going to make you famous so that your life points people towards me. If you see God selfishly, see God as a selfish, maniacal dictator, you're going to say, that sounds like a jerk. But as we've been saying, if you see God as a loving father who created each of us, you understand, if God is moving us into relationship with him, we are actually built to be in relationship with him, that we are designed to work best when we are in relationship with God. And so if my name becomes one that points people towards God, then my name has value because those people are going to be better off knowing God than they were before they knew him. There's a desire in us to be known. But if our only desire is to be known so people will see how great we are, that desire is flawed. If the desire in us is to be known so that we can point people towards God, that becomes something that is vital and important and real. If people think of Jerry, and when they think of Jerry, they think of Jesus, then Jerry is doing exactly what he was created to do. When people see you that way, your name becomes something that is valuable, not just now, but eternally. You see, today we're talking about this guy Abram, and we're talking about something that happened 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. But beyond that, we're talking about something that's going to matter 40 billion years from now. Because God used Abram to bring forth salvation that changes us for eternity. You see, there's something in us that is built for something more. And that's what Jesus actually says in Matthew chapter 5 later on. He says this, you are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it will give light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your deeds, your good deeds, shine out for all to see so that everyone who will praise your Father will praise your heavenly Father. When you and I, if you are a follower of Jesus, point people towards hope, we become a light in a dark world. We all agree how dark this place is. We can all agree that stuff is not the way that it's supposed to be. But Jesus says that when we become people who bring light with us, bring the light of Jesus with us, we actually bring hope into this world. And that's what God is doing through Abram. Then he says something else in verse 3. He says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. This is a fantastic promise of God. God says, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who stand against you. I'm going to be your defender. I remember when I was going into middle school, I thought I was so tough. Not that I was tough. I wasn't tough. I was the opposite of tough. But my older stepbrother, who was about 5 years older than me, and he was an average-sized human. But as a middle school kid, I thought he was a mountain because he played football and he was strong. But he said to me, he said, if anybody ever gives you a hard time and they're coming out to get you, you just let me know and I will have your back. Now, if you set yourself up in your own stupid stuff, then you're on your own. But I'm going to have your back. And the idea of anybody having my back just made me feel amazing. God says to Abram, if you'll walk with me, I got you. If you'll walk with me, I'm going to make you a blessing, and I'm going to take care of these things. This is a lot, again, if you go read Romans 12, talking about the dark things that happen to us and the things that hurt us and destroy us. when we talk about forgiveness and we talk about stepping away from the judgment seat, God says, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay," says the Lord. God knows what needs to be done. He knows what has happened to you. He knows what may be going on and where we are. And when God says these things, he is saying, I see it, and I'm not going to leave you in this place defenseless. And what do we do with that? There are stories, right, of Christians who, I went to Rome with a school trip with EVCA here a few years ago. I was able to be a sponsor and went to Rome, and one of the eeriest experiences of my life was going into the Colosseum and looking down on this place where thousands of my brothers and sisters were killed for their faith. What do we do with that? Is God letting them down? Did God not follow through with his promise? Our lives in this place are temporary. Right? There are earthly blessings that God does in this time. But the blessing of eternity, the blessing of life outside of this separated, of this body that is broken, is going to be greater than anything we can experience on this side. Some of us have experienced terrible things in this world, and some of us have spent our entire lives trying not to experience terrible things in this world. And regardless of how much you set yourself up to not experience terrible things, sooner or later, the brokenness is coming for you. This body is going to fail. But God sees the things that happen to you, and He's going to deal righteously and in righteous judgment with the people who have done the things that should have never been done. And if your faith is in Him, He's going to bless you now with hope and a peace, and then in eternity with a body that no longer has to suffer. All of this starts in this promise. And how do I know this? Because of the last verse that it says here. And all of the families on earth will be blessed through you. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Every group and tribe and nation and people is going to be blessed through Abraham. Now that's wild. Right? That word all in the Hebrew means all. The idea that everyone is blessed through you, that is nuts. Right? That's crazy talk on our own. But God can do that, and He did do that. You see, Abraham never would have seen this at the time. You wouldn't have known this at the time. But this passage right here, this last little chunk of a verse, is a messianic promise that everyone is going to be blessed through this man, that everyone who is in existence is going to be blessed through this man, that his name and his existence is going to affect everyone that was going to come afterwards. How is that possible? Let me explain how that's possible. Abraham ultimately would go, and he and his wife are going to have a lot of different things. We'll talk about this next week. Going to make some crazy decisions. They're going to have some false starts and some mistakes and some different things like that. But ultimately, Abraham and his wife are going to have some children, and those children are going to have children, and pretty soon this couple within 400 years is going to be 2 million people. And from those people, they're going to end up in this land that God showed them, and in that land, they're going to one day. There's going to be a man born. And this man born is not going to be born the same way that the rest of us is born. From the descendants of Abraham would come Jesus. And Jesus would ultimately die to pay for the brokenness and the darkness and the pain that you carry inside you. But He would die so that stuff would not have to own you, and it wouldn't have to own you now, and it ultimately would not own your eternity. Like we have been saying for the last 3 weeks, and I'm so thankful we had a chance to talk about the last 3 weeks, because I'm really thankful for today. On our own, we can't save ourselves, but we got to know this. We've got to know this. God did not leave humanity to rot in its brokenness. God does not leave us in this. He does not desire to leave us in this place where, you know what, you're terrible and you're broken and you're stupid and you're an idiot and you make bad decisions, so you just have to deal with it. From Abraham would come our hope. God does not desire to sit and watch us suffer with no hope. And so from this old couple with no potential, God brings about hope for us. And so this is my bottom line for you guys today, what I want you to remember from this. God sees and he blesses faith. Right? So Abraham sees this man, or God sees this man, he calls him out, and then when he walks, he blesses him. He blesses that faith. Abraham did go. He went, and that story changes us today. If you read a little further, though, what you see is that Abraham goes, and he goes to this land, and he gets there, and he's doing his thing, but then 75 years old becomes 85 years old, and Abraham finds himself asking God, God, this whole nation thing you're talking about here, how is this going to happen? Look at verse 1 through 6 of Genesis 15. I'll just read this for you. It'll be up on the screen. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision, and he said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram said, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all the blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant of my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own. So one of my servants will be my heir. And the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside, and he said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars, if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted to him as righteous because of his faith. Abram, even after he started following God, found himself in a place where he said, "God, I don't see this working out the way that you promised." You ever been there? Where you're following and you desire that? And he asked God honestly, "God, I don't understand how you're going to do this whole thing if we're not even having kids. Look, I'm going to die here soon, and everything that the nation you're making me into, it doesn't seem to be working out. You're blessing me, but the nation thing doesn't seem to be working out. So all of my stuff's going to go to a servant." And God says, "No. Just believe." The important thing is verse 6, "And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." So today, as we look at the life of Abraham, we see a man who just went. We see a man who was honest with his doubts with God, who found himself questioning and not understanding, but instead of questioning and walking away, he went to God with his questions. He said, "God, I don't understand how this is going to work because it doesn't seem to make sense." And God says, "No, go outside and look. I'm going to work the blessing." And when God reminded him of the blessing, it says Abram believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. When we walk with God, there will be times when you doubt. When you walk with God, there's going to be times when you don't understand. But when you walk with God and you bring your doubts to him, God actually credits your faith to you as righteousness. He says, that's what righteousness looks like. Righteousness doesn't look like a man who never has doubts. Righteousness looks like a man who, in his doubts, says, "I'm just going to keep walking." Righteousness is a woman who says, I don't understand what you're doing, God, but I'm going to trust you in this for today. That's what faith looks like. So I got some things I want to ask you to do. With your head, I want to ask you to do something here. I want you to read this passage again, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and replace Abram's name with your name and ask yourself, would you do it? The Lord had said to Didi, "Leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to the land I will show you." The Lord said to Candace, "Leave your country and your people and your father's household." Put your name in there and ask yourself, would I do that? The Lord said to Marilyn, would I do that? Put your name in there and see if it fits. And if you look and say, I don't see it, that's a great place to start. Ask yourself why. Where is your faith, and what is it that's holding you back? When we have an honest conversation, we will have an honest conversation with God. And God can grow us from that place. And once you've had that conversation with your heart, I want to ask you to do something. Pray for the faith to act. Pray for the faith to act. To go when God guides us to go. How do I know when God is guiding me to have a conversation and to do something? Because He's always going to guide us to things that line up with His righteous acts. When God is guiding us to go and have a conversation, He's guiding us in that way. We'll know because it points towards His goodness. It doesn't point towards our selfishness. I bring this up because there's a dangerous thing that we run into whenever I talk about faith to go. I've had conversations in my office with men and women who say, I feel like God is guiding me to leave my spouse because I've met somebody else who seems to get me better than my spouse. That goes against the commandments of God. Just because you feel something doesn't mean that it's from God. But if God is guiding you towards something that lines up with His commands in Scripture, pray for God to give you the faith to act. And then I want to ask you to do something. We actually got some journals outside here today. If you haven't grabbed one of those, take one. But I want you to journal the things that God has already done. Journal the prayers that God has answered and the ones that you're still waiting to see fulfilled. Journal about the things that God has already fulfilled in your life as you've walked in faith in Him. But also the things you haven't seen yet. You see, Abram in Genesis 15 is saying, God, I haven't seen what you're talking about here yet. I don't see it. Write those things down and say, God, I don't see the blessing here. I'm waiting for that blessing. I'm waiting to see what you're going to do. But journal about it in a way that you're trusting God to fulfill it. Abram was no different than you and I. He was not a perfect man. He was not a righteous man on his own. He was just a man that God chose to use. I believe that we're in a room today with many people that God is choosing to use if we're open to being used. And so my prayer has been this week, and my prayer is going to be right now, that when God says to go, we'd be people that went.